Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on decarbonizing Japan's steel sector, modeling pathways to net zero. I'm Abhishek Shivakumar, co-head of modeling at TransitionZero, and today I'm joined by Akira Kanno, research analyst at Transition Asia. Go ahead and get the presentation. Oh, yeah, I hope everyone can see this. Okay. So today's agenda, we're going to be covering a range of topics, including an overview of Japan's steel sector and the motivation behind our modeling and the research question that we're asking here. This will be followed by the different input data and assumptions we've made in our models. The modeling approach itself, we're going to describe our modeling approach, and are excited to share an open source modeling package that we've developed as part of this work. And finally, we'll present an application of that modeling package to the case of decarbonization in Japan across a range of scenarios. Just some housekeeping. If you have any questions, please do use the Q&A function that you should find on Zoom. We'll get to the questions at the end of today's presentation, which should take about 45 to 50 minutes. So please send your questions there, and we'll get to it at the end of our presentation. But before we get into the main topic of today's webinar, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about TransitionZero. So at TransitionZero, we aim to help governments and their partners plan for the transition to clean energy. And we do this through three pillars: open data, accessible software, and expert insights. Our thesis is that systems modeling is the engine of decision-making for decarbonization. We believe that most decarbonization will happen through electricity, and therefore investment decisions in electricity have a wide-ranging impact on the broader energy system and other sectors as well. However, the issue we found with a lot of systems modeling at the moment is that they are costly, closed, or inaccessible, and often all three. So our goal at TransitionZero is to produce tools that are free to use, are open source, and are accessible. So focusing on the user experience. So our goal is to build capacity rather than dependency. We showcase this through one of our flagship tools called Scenario Builder, which is a no-code user interface to quickly set up systems models and quickly get to the point of asking questions, answering different research questions, running different scenarios, and analyzing them. Moving on to the topic of today's webinar, we'll be focusing on applying our modeling tools to the case of decarbonizing Japanese steel. As a summary of what we found from our work, I would say we had three main takeaway messages. The first is that despite the significant share of emissions, global emissions that come from the steel sector, there's still a lack of effective tools to support planning of how this sector will be decarbonized. The second main takeaway message we'd like you to leave with is a clear understanding of TZ-OSeMOSYS-STEEL, which is a open source package that we've developed in order to plug this gap that we identified in the first box. And finally, we applied this model to the case of Japan across a range of scenarios. And our model results show that for Japan's steel sector, with weak policies or low demand, it will continue to be dominated by the blast furnace route, so the BF-BOF route. But if more stringent emission targets are applied, or if there are higher demand pathways, we see a shift towards needing more innovative and novel technologies, including EAFs using gas-based or hydrogen-based HBI as feedstocks, especially towards 2050. But before we get into the modeling and the results itself, I'm going to hand over to Akira to give us an overview of Japan's steel sector. So over to you, Akira.
Okay. So let's begin with an overview of Japan's steel sector. So for many years, Japan was a powerhouse in steel production, consistently producing over 100 million tons of crude steel annually at its peak. In fact, Japan used to account for roughly a fifth of the world's steel output, making it an essential player in the global industry. But in recent years, production has been dropping. This is mostly down to lower domestic demand as the population declines, and also stronger competition from cheaper imports, especially coming in from China. Despite these challenges, Japan still produces approximately 84 million tons in 2024. That still makes the country the world's third largest producer after China and India. It's still a crucial part of both the Japanese economy and the global steel industry. So now let's take a closer look at the methods used in the steel production and the main players in Japan's industry. Yeah, thank you. So about 3/4 of Japan's steel is produced using the traditional blast furnace to basic oxygen furnace method known as BF-BOF, while the rest, around a quarter, came from electric arc furnaces or EAFs, which have a lower carbon footprint. Now, the key difference is that BF-BOF is what we call primary steel making. It starts from iron ore and turns it into new steel. EAFs, on the other hand, are mostly secondary steel making. They melt down scrap steel and recycle it into new products. Japan's BF-BOF steel sector is dominated by just only 3 companies: Nippon Steel, JFE, and Kobe Steel. Nippon Steel and JFE do virtually all their steel production via BF-BOF, and all of Kobe Steel's output comes this way as well. Together, these 3 make up about 75% of Japan's crude steel production. On the EAF side, there are around 31 companies, but they are all small to medium in size. There aren't any large EAF steelmakers in Japan. Next page, please. So let's talk more about where Japanese steel is used. Around 60 to 70% of Japanese steel is used domestically, mostly in the automotive and construction sectors, which means changes in these industries have a big impact on steel demand. The rest is shipped overseas. Steel production is a major source of Japan's CO2 emissions, responsible for about 131 million tons of CO2 annually, roughly 14% of the country's total emissions. To tackle this situation, the Japanese steel industry has committed to cutting emissions by 30% by 2030 compared to 2013 levels. In order to achieve the target, they're exploring multiple alternative pathways. These include both incremental improvements to existing processes and major shifts toward new production methods. For the BF-BOF route, they are expanding the amount of scrap used, injecting hydrogen through projects like Quartz 50 and Super Quartz 50, and using hot briquetted iron, or HBI, in the blast furnaces. In EAF-based pathways, Both scrap and HBI are important components in a shift toward low-carbon steelmaking. And looking even further ahead, hydrogen direct reduced ion, or H2DRI, offer real promise for slashing emissions over the long run. So now I'd like to go into detail on the main options for decarbonizing the blast furnace route, which still accounts for most of Japan's steel production. Next page, please. First, there's increasing the use of scrap in a basic oxygen furnace. It's a very simple step, and firms like Nippon Steel and JFE are already doing this. The next step is injecting hydrogen into the blast furnaces. You might have heard about this as the Course 50 or Super Course 50 projects here in Japan. The basic idea is that hydrogen helps reduce the amount of coke needed, which in turn cuts down on CO2 emissions. The original Course 50 initiative began back in 2008, aiming for a 30% reduction in emissions, thanks to a mix of hydrogen injection and carbon capture and storage, or CCS. The next stage, Super Course 50, goes even further, targeting more than a 50% cut by using externally heated hydrogen and again rely on CCS, with a target to scale up by 2040. In recent trials by Nippon Steel, emissions intensity was reduced by up to 43% with 12 cubic meters experimental furnace. However, there are big challenges. Both these projects depend heavily on CCS, which is tough in Japan due to limited geological storage and high costs. And finally, the use of HBI, or hot briquetted iron, is another approach. Companies like Kobe Steel and JFE are already importing HBI from the Middle East to use in their blast furnaces. Adding HBI means less coke is needed, helping to lower emissions compared to the classic method. All these options are considered transitional. They can reduce emissions, but they do still depend on fossil fuels. Next page, please. Then let's now look at how expanding electric-based steelmaking could support the sector's decarbonization. Each year, Japan produces around 37 million tons of scrap, recycling about 85% back into new steel, mainly via EAFs. So making the most of domestic scrap is one option for moving the industry toward lower emissions. That said, the quality of scrap often limits which steel grades can actually be made. So to get around this, one option is to invest in better scrap sorting tech or blend with HPI. Jeffrey, for example, has announced that their new EAF starting up in 2028 will use HBI imported from the United Arab Emirates. And crucially, when EAFs use renewable electricity, their carbon footprint is much lower than the traditional blast furnaces. And looking further ahead, hydrogen holds enormous promise. Direct reduction of iron using hydrogen, ideally green hydrogen made from renewables, could slash emissions by over 95% compared to the standard BFO method. Both Nippon Steel and JFE are working hard to scale up this technology, aiming for commercial H2DRI production by around 2040. Next page, please. Achieving such deep decarbonization will also require support from effective policy measures. In Japan, there are several policy measures, but two main policy tools are steering decarbonization in the steel sector. First one is the Strategic Field Domestic Production Promotion Tax System. It provides tax credits for steel produced via EAF after making the transition from BF-BOF. This tax credit system lasts for 10 years. It starts at around $132 per ton in the first 7 years, then drops to 99, 66, and finally $33 in the 10th year. And another one is the energy and manufacturing process transformation support business. It offers subsidies covering a third of capital investment when plants switch from blast furnace production to EAF. For instance, Nippon Steel is building EAFs with capacity for 2.9 million tons per year, with more than 250 billion Japanese yen in support. And JFE is also joining with up to 104.5 billion Japanese yen in help for its own new EAF with capacity for 2 million tons per year. These policies are vital for accelerating the industry's transformation toward green steel. Next page, please. So moving on, let's talk about the assumptions and input data in our analysis for modeling Japan's steel sector up to 2050. In our model to map possible decarbonization pathways for Japan's steel sector to 2050, we set up a scenario matrix. The model identifies a cost-optimal production mix based on selected policy targets, like I said before, and constraints. We consider 3 levels of demand: high, medium, and low, as well as 3 levels of decarbonization constraints from no constraint to net zero plus overseas scope 1 and 2 emissions. This results in a total of 9 scenarios. By comparing them, we can see how demand and decarbonization constraints influence Japan's steel production mix by 2050. Next page, please. So let's detail the demand scenarios that shape these pathways. For future steel demand, we drew on projections from the Nippon Steel Research Institute and modeled 3 scenarios. In the high demand scenario, Japan remains competitive in automotive and steel exports, with steel demand reaching about 76.9 million tons by 2050. The medium scenario assumes a gradual decline in competitiveness, with demand falling to about 63.6 million tons. And the low demand scenario sees a major loss in exports and vehicle production, dropping demand to just only 34.6 million tons by 2050. The projected declines are due to factors such as an aging population, market saturation, and external competition. Next page, please. So alongside demand, decarbonization targets are equally crucial for modeling the sector's future. In our modeling, we assume that CO2 emissions from Japan's steel industry will fall in a straight line. The target is a 30% reduction by 2030 compared to 2013, aligning with industry commitments. After that, emissions decline linearly to reach a 90% overall reduction by 2050. This equates to emissions falling from 136 million tons in 2030 to just under 20 million tons by 2050. Next, I'll introduce the main steel production routes evaluated in our analysis. Next page, please. Our model covers 11 steel production routes across the 3 main technologies: BF-BOF, DRI-EAF, and HBI or scrap EAF. For each, we account for material inputs like coke, natural gas, green hydrogen, and electricity. These include both traditional and innovative processes, such as blast furnace routes with extra scrap, hydrogen injection, HBI blending, and various forms of direct reduction using green hydrogen or natural gas, either in Japan or via imports. So let's go deeper into the key characteristics and inputs for each major production route. Next page, please. There are several BF variants. The most common is coke plus PCI, where pulverized coal is injected as a cheaper supplement for metallurgical coke. That's the standard approach for adding efficiency and cutting costs. And there's also the higher scrap ratio process, which allows more scrap to be added to the basic oxygen furnace, well beyond the usual 25 to 30% limit that classic BF lines can manage. Then we have Course 50 and Super Course 50. These are advanced versions where green hydrogen is injected into the blast furnace, replacing part of the coke as a reducing agent and cutting down CO2 emissions further. In our model, we don't look at CCS, mainly because we don't really have solid data on things like costs or capture rates for carbon capture in the steel industry, and also because it's quite difficult to realistically build retrofitting technologies into the model. So instead, we focus only on hydrogen injection into the blast furnace. And finally, there's a route that involves adding imported HBI directly into the blast furnace. This can boost productivity and also reduce coke usage compared to the standard mix. For reference, both the Super Course 50 and HBI-based routes can cut coke usage by around 35 to 40% compared to traditional methods. However, they still depend on fossil fuel usage. Then now let's discuss the direct reduction and EAF routes, which become increasingly important as decarbonization accelerates. The traditional versions relies on natural gas to reduce iron ore. It's the main DRI method worldwide now. If you replace half of the natural gas with green hydrogen, you get a 50-50 method that starts cutting fossil emissions significantly. And go to 100% green hydrogen, and you set for some of the lowest possible emissions, provided the hydrogen itself is actually green. There are trade-offs though. The energy requirement in the form of electricity rises with a higher share of hydrogen. So reliable sources of low carbon electricity become essential. Finally, let's look at the EAF-only routes using either HBI or scrap. The HBI or scrap EAF routes also play an important role. HBI can be produced with green hydrogen or with natural gas, and is commonly imported to supplement scrap stocks in EAFs. In our model, the input data for green and gas-based HBI are exactly the same. The only difference is the emission factor, which changes when we take overseas Scope 1 and 2 emissions into account, alongside the associated costs. And of course, the most straightforward route is to use scrap in EAFs, which is a low carbon option as long as electricity used is renewable. Where supply or quality limits constrain scrap use, integrating HBI, especially green HBI, helps make higher grade steel while still cutting overall emissions. Next page, please. To calculate the cost and emission intensity for each steel production route, we looked at the prices of various commodities along with their emission factors. Using the latest data available, we projected how those commodity prices in Japan might change up to 2050. And we've also worked out the emission factors for each commodity, covering both Scope 1 and combined Scope 1 plus 3 emissions. So we can estimate the CO2 emissions linked to the different steel production routes. Then, having covered the key assumptions and input data, the next step is to discuss how these factors are incorporated into our modeling framework. So I will now pass it over to Avi.
Thank you so much, Akira. So we worked with Transition Asia to, and Akira and Alistair specifically to collect all of this, data, all these data sets. As you can imagine, this kind of modeling is a data intensive process. And so their expert guidance and the high resolution data was a crucial input to our model. But now moving on to the modeling approach itself, when we look to address the research question in this study, we found that applying existing system modeling approaches could fit well with steel sector modeling. So what we did is to apply traditional least cost capacity expansion modeling to the steel sector. At a high level, what this model does is it answers two main questions: when to invest in new capacity and how to operate that new capacity. So, when to invest in a new EAF asset, how much to build, which year to build it in, which route to operate, and so on. The way it makes these decisions is that it solves for this overall capacity mix, the optimal capacity mix, in a way that it minimizes the total system costs, the combined total system costs, while meeting the demand for steel at all times during the year and for all future years between now and from the present to any future year. And it does so while adhering to all resource and other operational constraints. These could be things like technology growth rates, could be the limits on feedstock, and so on. And it also ensures that it does so by adhering to all user-defined policies and targets, so the emission reduction target, for instance. So this was the modeling approach that we applied. We then formulated this into an open source package called TZ-OSeMOSYS-STEEL. Now, the main features of TZ-OSeMOSYS-STEEL are that it's Python-based, so it's easy to integrate with other existing packages for optimization, for plotting, and so on. It's flexible. So in addition to the technologies and the representation and the dynamics that we have included here, any user will be able to add new technologies, alternate routes, alternate representations as well. It's also scalable. So we've applied this to the Japanese case, and we've applied this at the national level. But the model framework itself can be easily applied to a different country by swapping in the country-specific data and assumptions. And it can also easily be made higher or lower resolution. So it can be subnational or can combine multiple countries into a regional type analysis as well. And finally, as I mentioned, it's open source, released under an AGPL 3.0 license. We'd encourage all our audience members to check it out at this GitHub link and have a play around with it, and you'll be able to replicate the analysis that we are presenting here today. Specifically looking at the model setup for the study that we're presenting today, as Akira mentioned, we looked at a matrix of 9 scenarios. So we crossed 3 demand projections, so low, medium, and high, against 3 emissions constraints. So one was an unconstrained scenario where the model was free to optimize purely on a cost basis. The second was where we applied a net zero scenario. We call it net zero. It achieves 90% emission reduction compared to 2013 by 2050. And the implicit assumption here is that the remaining 10% would be decarbonize using offsets or other market-based mechanisms. And finally, we did an alternate version of the net zero scenario. And in this case, we took into account the emissions associated with the HBI that's imported. We were finding that the model was choosing to import a lot of HBI because those upstream emissions aren't included. And so these emissions, which would be scope 3 emissions, by including them, we wanted to see what impact that would have on the cost optimal mix. The model runs from 2025 to 2050. It has all existing and planned steel production capacity in Japan. And what it produces in terms of results are that it produces the optimal mix of capacity by technology type over time, the annual steel production from each of these routes, the total system cost, and the emissions on an annual and a model period basis. Again, recapping what Akira presented earlier. So this is a summary of the different production routes that we modeled. So as Akira said, we modeled 11 production routes across 3 different types of technologies. So BF, BOF, DRI, EAF, and EAF. The thing to mention, though, is that we've separated the EAF based on whether it uses recycled steel or whether it uses HBI. So the one that uses recycled steel produces secondary steel, which has a separate demand. And the other remaining 10 routes produce primary steel. This is important to note. And to summarize the differences between the routes, if you look at the emissions intensity of the different routes, comparing them on the left, you can see that it goes from the traditional BF-BOF coke route all the way at the top at about 2 tons per ton of steel. And this doesn't really change very much over time. But at the other end of the scale, you can see that some of the DRI, EAF, and EAF routes have very low emissions that are likely to decrease even further by 2050, reaching almost zero in the case of DRI, EAF, with the entirely powered by green hydrogen. And closely following that is the EAF hydrogen-based HBI route. What falls in between is the remaining BF-BOF routes, so the scrap injection, course 50, and so on. But when we switch to the looking at the right-hand side at the cost of these different routes, you can see that the route that has the lowest emissions intensity by 2050, so that's a DRI EAF green hydrogen route, is in fact the most expensive route, which is and significantly higher than the next most expensive one. You find that the DRI EAF routes that use hydrogen, either at 50% or 100%, are the most expensive, while the EAF routes, both the gas-based HBI and the hydrogen HBI, are cost competitive. So what we're finding from these figures are that the EAF routes are both the lowest emissions intensity by 2050, as well as the most cost competitive by 2050 as well. But when we ran this in the model, we wanted to see what the implications of these trends would be within the model. How would it affect the cost optimal mix and the evolution of Japan's steel sector? And again, to recap, we did a matrix of 9 scenarios, low, medium, high demands, and 3 decarbonization constraints. Now moving to our modeling results. So we applied this across the 9 scenarios. So this first set of results looks at the low demand scenario across the 3 decarbonization constraints, which are shown in order over here. And what we found is that BF-BOF in the low demand scenario continues to dominate primary steel production all the way out to 2050. So, even with the net zero scenarios, it still continues to be BF-BOF all the way to 2050. What we did see, though, is that the BF-BOF route itself switches from the traditional coke route to the scrap injection route from about 2035. And we saw this across all three scenarios as well. What we also found is that in the two net zero scenarios from about 2040, the gas-based HBI powered EAF starts entering the capacity mix. And by 2050, some of the BF-BOF, which was powered by scrap injection, also converts to the hydrogen-based HBI. And in the case of the Scope 3 emissions, it converts the BF-BOF entirely into a hydrogen-based HBI-powered BF-BOF. Our analysis of these results is that in a low demand scenario, instead of building new capacity, it's more cost-effective to continue using existing BF-BOF capacity and instead just invest in any requirements to convert the routes within a BF-BOF technology. And this can be supplemented with an EAF using gas-based HBI as the feedstock. Now, moving on to the medium demand scenario. Some of the trends are similar to the low demand, but there are some notable differences as well. So the similarities are that, again, BF-BOF does continue to dominate primary steel production in the unconstrained scenario. And gas-based HBI, EAF with gas-based HBI starts entering the system in 2035 across all three scenarios. But the capacity of this EAF, the gas-based HBI EAF, stays constant in the unconstrained scenario, but its share starts increasing in the net zero scenarios. And interestingly, by 2050, when you take Scope 3 emissions into account, a part of that EAF capacity is converted to hydrogen-based HBI. So by 2050, primary steel production is entirely covered by the EAF route, and it's almost evenly divided between the gas-based HBI and the hydrogen-based HBI. Now, moving on to the final set of scenarios. So the high demand scenario. What we found here is in the case of the unconstrained scenario, BF-BOF continues to dominate. There's not too much of a difference between the low and medium cases. And again, similarly, the EAF route with gas-based HBI increases its share for the net zero case without Scope 3 emissions. But when Scope 3 emissions are taken into account in the high demand case by 2045 to 2050, there is a role for the hydrogen-based HBI to play, and it in fact dominates the mix by 2050. One other interesting finding from the high demand scenario is that we saw that the DRI-EAF gas-based route enters the system in all three scenarios in a limited capacity from about 2030 onwards. It seems to be a kind of transitional technology, while the costs of the other more innovative routes decrease in later years. And we combined all of these results into some simplified metrics, looking at the carbon abatement cost in dollars per ton of CO2. The way we calculated this was we took the total system cost for the unconstrained scenario, net zero scenario, and the net zero with Scope 3 emissions included. and the differential between the system cost divided by the differential between the emissions, the emission reduction, gave us these CO2 abatement costs. We were quite surprised by the modest CO2 abatement costs in the net zero scenario. But the reason for this is without the scope 3 emissions of HBI taken into account, it is a cost-effective route to get to net zero. So gas-based HBI can be produced quite cost-effectively, and by not including these emissions, quite modest CO2 abatement costs are required across all three demand scenarios. However, once the scope 3 emissions are taken into account, so the gas-based HBI then becomes a lot more emissions intensive. We found that there's a 3 to 9x, up to 9x higher CO2 abatement costs across all three scenarios. And again, this was an interesting finding. And again, we limited the scope 3 emissions consideration to the HBI imports, because that was the commodity that was having the largest impact on the model, but including scope 3 and other life cycle emissions across the board would potentially change the results some more. Finally, moving on to the conclusions of our study. The main takeaways, again, just to recap, we found that having effective planning tools like the one we presented here could be quite helpful to plan steel sector decarbonization. And by providing TZ-OSeMOSYS-STEEL as an open source package, it's something we hope that the wider community can just pick up, use, and improve, adapt to their own research questions and possibly other geographies as well. And finally, we found that for Japan's steel sector specifically, unless there are stronger emission reduction policies, it's likely that the BF-BOF route will continue to dominate. But with stronger policies and high demand, there may be a transition to more innovative routes like the HBI-based EAF, the hydrogen-based HBI. If you'd like to read our analysis in more detail, you can find that on these two analysis blogs on the TransitionZero website. One details our methodology in building TZ-OSeMOSYS-STEEL, and the other one looks at the analysis of the model results itself. And finally, to wrap up, I'd like to end with some acknowledgements. As I mentioned, this entire work was carried out in close collaboration with Akira and Alistair from Transition Asia. They're experts on the Japanese steel sector and steel more generally. And so it wouldn't have been possible to do this work without our great collaboration with them. The other thing to mention is that this model was built upon an earlier version that Anthea Lam produced during her MSc thesis at TransitionZero last year. We're really grateful to her for the work she did during that time, and we're glad that we were able to continue to build on it. A former colleague, Ashank Sinha, who was the head of industry at TransitionZero, initially led this project and originated it, so we're grateful to him as well. And finally, probably most importantly, we're grateful to the European Climate Foundation, who are the ones who made this work possible through their continued funding and support of TransitionZero's work. I would be happy to move on to any questions that you might have. I haven't been able to look at the Q&A chat, but I'll do that now.
Yes, thanks everyone for sending in your questions. Abby, just to let you know, all of the questions are in the chat. There's quite a few. I'm not sure you'll be able to answer everything, but please go ahead and have a look.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm seeing the questions now. So the first one from Jeon Lee. Again, I hope I'll be pronouncing everyone's names correctly, but please forgive me if I don't. So the question is, are your input data and assumptions general figures which can be applied to other countries, or is it adapted for Japan? It's a really good question. So our modeling framework, I would say it's a mix of data that is specific to Japan and data that could be applicable to other countries. The overall model structure itself is applicable to any country. So for instance, the different inputs and the different ratios of those inputs for different routes, that's applicable to any other country. But things like the commodity prices, the electricity prices, all the policy inputs, like the policy incentives on CapEx and OpEx that Akira described, demands, all those are Japan specific. But again, if you'd like to adapt this to a different country, we'd be happy to talk to you about it. I really do believe it's quite straightforward to do it. The second question from Xiaowei Chao is on CCS is not included in this model due to limitation of parameters availability. However, will this hinder the policy application of this model? If so, do you have any suggestion to overcome this challenge? So I can give an initial answer, and then maybe Akira just fill in case I've missed anything. I would say our goal with this model is not necessarily to produce the one right answer, but instead provide a tool that can be used for scenario exploration. So an alternate version can be created where CCS is included and different projections and assumptions around CCS can be made, and you can see how that would affect the model results. We in our research just found that there wasn't really sufficient data available around this, and it didn't seem like a realistic option for decarbonization, given the kind of recent experimental results that we read about. But Akira, please fill in case I've missed anything.
Yeah, I'm the same opinion with Abhi, but yeah, it's true that incorporating CCS will reduce emission intensity, but it would also increase costs. So it's just in my opinion, but I don't expect it to significantly affect the policy application of this model. I mean, as suggested by our results, for now, the role of such technologies is likely to remain rather limited, I guess. Yeah.
Thanks, Akira. The next question is from Jasmine Fowler Morrow. Thanks for the presentation and the transparent and open source approach. Interested whether any policy settings were also built into the demand emission scenarios. So yeah, it's probably worth us clarifying. So for the demand and emission scenarios, in fact, the demand, emissions, and policy incentives are all based on actual policies and projections from Japan. So the presentation includes kind of links and references to all of them. The main ones are, so demand is from the Nippon Steel Research Institute's projections. Emissions is from the government itself. So there's a benchmark year of 2013 and an emission reduction target of 30% by 2030. And in terms of the policy incentives, there are two main policy packages that Akira presented. One which provides an OpEx incentive predominantly, and the other one that provides a capex incentives. One, the more steel you produce, the more benefit you get, and that tapers down over the years. And in the capex incentive, it's a one-time incentive when you convert the plant, and these are taken into account in the model capex and opex. And yeah, the additional question are inputs. Are the HBI import prices based on certain locations, or the price only representative at present? Again, Akira, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the HBI, gas-based HBI was based on Oman, I think, as the export
right.
location, and for the hydrogen-based one, Australia, if I'm not mistaken.
It's also Oman.
Also Oman, yeah. Got it.
Yeah.
Can this analysis be applied at a company level? As in, yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't see why not. I would say that with some caveats. So I think with a country level model, we have a lot of these things like demand projections and so on, which a country may be able to set. At a company level, I wonder what that would look like. I suppose, yeah, Nippon Steel Research Institute does have its own projections, so those could be downscaled to the company level. So yeah, I don't see why not. Essentially, the model, what would need to be updated in the model is the capacities, which are now at a country level. So those would need to be updated to what is within a company's portfolio. And things like the demand projections would need to be plugged in as well. But otherwise, it's possible. And yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned this question is from Harshant. From an anonymous attendee, could you please share the key finding, what the advantages and disadvantages would have been if you had comparative research? Yeah, so if we had more, alternate scenarios, more abundant scrap or, scarce scrap, renewable energy costs, this is exactly the kind of questions that we built this modeling package to be able to answer. So any user can go in and run any or all of these scenarios with quite simple tweaks to the model. These are all quite easy to tweak in the model, these assumptions around scrap availability, efficiencies, and so on. So I would say the harder part there is in fact just finding finding reliable data. And there's a question from Sanjeev Manocha. Is it the reason for not including CCU as well? Yeah, we did. I should admit, we kind of combined both under the same kind of box, CCU and CCS. But Akira, I don't know if you have anything to add on CCU and why it was included.
It's the same reason for CCS, so we don't have any specific data about CCU as well, so that's the reason.
I do believe that addresses all the questions in the Q&A. Just going into the chat to see if there's anything. Yeah, it seems like all the questions. Maybe there are a couple from Thomas and Yvonne. So one was on whether the model distinguishes between stationary energy emissions and IPPU. And you have the breakdown of abatement costs. So what the emissions that this takes into account are essentially what Scope 1 for the steel asset and Scope 2 as well. So from the emissions intensity of the electricity input. we would be able to pull out the abatement costs by scope as well. Yeah, it is a good point. We could split that out by scope 1, 2, and 3 potentially. And this question on, is a Stegra or H2 steel Sweden-like innovation possible in Japan? Maybe this is a question for you, Akira. I think this is the H2 green steel project, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe it's something different. I'm not sure.
I'm not sure whether it's possible or not, but yeah, currently in Japan, the three main steel companies, Nippon Steel, JFE, and Kobe Steel, are the most dominant companies in the steel industry. So perhaps it is more difficult to that kind of things happen, especially in Japan. Yeah.
Thanks, Akira. I see that we've I think answered all of the questions. I hope, and yeah, we are also at the end of reaching the end of time. So I just want to wrap up by saying thank you so much for attending this webinar. We're really excited to be able to share this work with you, and we really encourage everyone to check out the modeling package that we're releasing under an open source license. And yeah, it's really exciting to hear questions around applying this to other research areas and potentially other countries as well. So we'd be happy to chat about that and follow up on that afterwards as well. So thank you so much for your time.